There's a story about my grandfather and my father that I love to hear and I love to tell. When my dad was in the Navy, he was home on leave, and while he was home, he borrowed his dad's car and took it out to go hang out with his friends or do whatever. And while he was out driving the car, he somehow managed to scratch it on the passenger side door. And this was his father's prized automobile. And he knew that he was going back to the Navy the next day, and he knew that his dad would be furious when he saw the scratch on the side. So he brought the car home, and he parked it in the driveway with the good side facing the house, and he never said a word about it. He went inside, went to bed, got up early the next morning, caught his ride with his buddy, and drove back to Norfolk and got back on his ship and went back into the Navy for another several months, however long it was until he came home again. Months go by, he's on the ship, he's in the Navy, and finally it comes time for him to come home again for another short respite. He comes home, walks through the door, and sitting facing him at the kitchen table is his father, with the keys to the car in his hand. And the keys hit my dad in the chest, bounce off of him and fall to the floor, and his dad stands up from the table and says, "There you go, you little son of a bitch, why don't you fuck it up the rest of the way?" It was almost as if he had been sitting at that table waiting for him to come home all those months. And the reason I tell you that story is not to tell you about my father, although I love my father and admire him greatly, but to begin to tell you about his father, my grandfather, who was a man of several nicknames. Some people called him Buck, and some people called him Killer. Both of those nicknames derive from his younger days when he was a hunter, and rumor has it was a very impressive shot with a rifle. Some people called him Don because that was his name. But I always called him Pap. To try to explain in any comprehensive way the impact that Pap had on my life, and still has on my life even to this day, would be foolish. It would be hopeless, because he influenced my life in so many ways, in little ways and in really big ways, that affect how I go through every single day of my life. Like, for instance, what I'm doing right now, driving. Pap is the one who taught me how to drive. He had a Jeep Cherokee at the time, an SUV, this beautiful, deep, dark color of green, and we would just drive everywhere in that. We would drive just to drive, and sometimes we would drive to a particular place to do something or to run an errand or something like that, but most of the time we would just drive. We would just go places that we wanted to go, and we would talk the whole time, and there was very little driving instruction. It was just experience. It sort of bit me on the ass once, because I learned so much about Pap, and I learned so much about driving from him, that I also picked up a few of his bad driving habits, and I actually failed my driver's test the first time I took it, because I did a rolling stop, like Pap always did. He never came to a complete stop at a stop sign. He would slow way, way down, and if there was nobody coming, he would just sort of keep on rolling through. And legally, you're not allowed to do that. You have to go to a complete stop. So I did that the first time I took the driver's test. I didn't even make it past the first stop sign, and the lady administering the test in the car with me said, "Okay, that's good. You can pull back around." Like, that was all the further I got. And I remember my dad saying, "Oh man, he failed because of you. You should have taught him how to stop the right way, not the way you do it, but the right way." And, you know, I mean, it wasn't that big of a deal. I came back the next week and took the test again and passed. But I always remember I took after Pap a little too much that time, and I had to take the driver's test the second time in order to pass it. And, you know, even before he taught me how to drive, before I could drive, we would have these, to me, really important moments together in cars. He would take me to school in the morning, at least for most of my middle school career and then into the first year or two of high school before I learned how to drive on my own and could transport myself. Pap would take my brother and I to school. And at the time, Danny, my brother, who's about 5 years younger than I am, was still in elementary school, and I was going to middle school and then high school. So I would have to leave a little bit later. So we had different school hours. So Pap would take us to school separately. And when it was time to take me to school, we would always leave early enough, maybe half an hour early, so that we could go to McDonald's for breakfast. And we would stop and go through the drive-thru and get breakfast and coffee. And we would sit there in his car and we would talk. And we did that every morning from Monday through Friday for the whole school year. He would come and pick us up every day. And we spent so much time together, just the two of us, before school, eating Egg McMuffins and drinking coffee and talking about whatever, talking about politics, talking about movies, talking about baseball, talking about what was going on in each of our lives. They were some of the most precious times I've ever spent with anyone in my life. And talk about getting a great start on the school day, spending, half an hour of one-on-one time with my grandfather, who I idolized and who I thought of not just as a sort of quasi-parental figure or a role model for adulthood, but as a friend. We were really close friends. There were times when we were more like brothers with just a massive age difference than we were grandfather and grandson. And it's those times when he would pick me up and take me to school in junior high and high school that I think about the most and that I treasure the most, because I remember the talks that we would have. But he would occasionally drop in to take us to school when we were much younger as well. It would depend. If the weather was not so nice, he would come and pick us up and take us to school. If mom had to work, and dad usually had to work in the morning, so he was never available to take us to school. We lived close enough to the school that we didn't ride the bus, but far enough away that if the weather was really nasty, we wouldn't really want to walk. So he would come and pick us up. And I remember even when I was in preschool, there's a great story of Pap picking me up to take me to preschool, and I did not want to go to school. And I worked on him and said, "Pap, I don't want to go to school. I want to stay with you." And it worked. I got to spend the day with Pap. He didn't take me to school. He didn't take me to preschool. And when he brought me home, Mom was home. Mom, I think, had to work that day. And Pap brought me home, and he said to Mom, he said, "Well, look, Steve just really didn't want to go to school today. So, I kept him with me." And Mom she wasn't like furious about it, but she wasn't pleased. And it became sort of a touchstone, sort of a funny story that we would always tell about just what a softy Pap was as a grandfather. He was not always such a softy to my dad when he was a father, but by the time he got to that grandfather stage, he was, in many cases, quite a pushover. I remember the night Pap died and how my dad and my brother and I spent so much of that night sitting around the kitchen table at Dad's house, telling stories about Pap, talking about what we remembered about him. And it wound up being a really wonderful night because we came together and we laughed so much as we talked about him. And I remember my dad trying to describe his father, Pap, and just always coming up short. And eventually he just sort of shook his head at a loss and just said he was just a hell of a guy. And I don't know what else I can say about him that would improve on that. My Pap was just a hell of a guy. I can tell you lots of other things about him that would give you a little bit more of a picture of what sort of a guy he was. He loved gadgets. He loved electronics. He was not the sort of senior citizen who was afraid of computers or technology. He had a little digital personal organizer before anyone else I knew had one. He had a camcorder before anyone else I knew had one. And he let me play with it and shoot things with it, make little miniature movies, which I think it's safe to say was an influence. He had a computer before any of us, and always had a newer, better computer than any of us had. And he never quite figured out how to use the computer to its fullest potential. He wasn't like a techie, but he was willing to try, and he was willing to learn, and he was interested in it, and he felt like it was important to keep up with things like that. You know, he had a cell phone before any of us had one. He worked on the railroad for 40 years. And the day he retired, I happened to be at his house with Granny when he came home from work that day. And he walked in and he said hello. He said, "Hi, how's everybody doing?" And made small talk with Granny for a minute. And then as he was going into the bedroom to take off his coat and change, he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm retired." He was a working man, but he saved his money. He invested wisely. He managed to put together a college fund for both myself and my brother that allowed us each to go to school, to continue our educations after high school without having to take out a single loan. We both were able to go to college. I went to a 4-year university, and Danny went to school to be an auto mechanic and makes a great living doing that now. And it was all a gift to us from Pap, because he had been so wise and so responsible in his saving over the years. He was married to Granny, my grandmother, for 50 years. And I think to this day, they are still my model of what a marriage should be. They were both very strong individuals, and yet they were utterly devoted to each other. They would laugh at each other. They would make fun of each other. They would give each other a hard time. They would occasionally say really mean things to each other that you couldn't imagine anyone else being able to say to them and get away with it. I remember even when Pap was sick at the end of his life, he smoked for many, many years, and he ended up succumbing to emphysema and lung problems and kidney problems just as a result of his smoking. And he was very ill for the last few years of his life. He was on oxygen for a long time, and he sort of shrunk and withered and was no longer active as he was for most of his life. Very active, very vibrant, vivacious guy. And I remember Granny saying to him once, they were having an argument in the last few years of his life. They were fighting about something, and Granny said, "Oh, shut up, you broken down old fool." And she was laughing as she said it. It was as if she heard herself saying this incredibly mean thing to this incredibly sick person, and the absurdity of it and the cruelty of it struck her as she was saying it, but she said it anyway. And Pap heard her say it, and you know, sort of looked at her like, and then looked at me and said something, probably made one of his stock jokes about, you know, one of these days he's gonna, you know, sell her to some Amish family if they need help on the farm, or, you know, he always said, I don't know about your grandmother, Steve. I'm afraid I'm gonna have to trade her in for a Mennonite woman. He would say that a lot. That was one of his favorite jokes when he and Granny were fighting about something. I don't know what else I can tell you about him. I can show you some pictures of him. Here's a picture of him. This is a picture of him when he was about 18 years old, when he was in the Navy. And doesn't he look like me? I mean, maybe it's giving myself too much of a compliment, but I think he looks a lot like me. Of course, he looks a lot like my father, too. We all really look alike, my brother as well. But I don't know. I remember a few years ago, the first time I saw that photograph of Pap as a young man, and it was striking how much he looked like me. And here's another one of him from
sometime after that. He's in his late 40s at this point when this photograph is taken. And that little baby in his arms is me. That's me and Pap. His name was Donald Lee Shives, Sr. That's my father's name, too. He's a junior. He was born December 29th, 1929. He died February 8th, 2004. He lived. He was here. He's not here anymore. I loved him. And I miss him.